So this is the last in our series of videos discussing the events of the Civil War. We're really going to pick it up here from when Grant takes over control of all the northern armies, all the way up until the end of the war, the 13th Amendment, and the assassination of Lincoln. So let's go ahead and get started. We discussed this slide earlier, but what I want to point out is the concept of total war. You're going to hear me talk about that. And that's just totally destroying not only the Southern armies or the Confederate armies, but everything and anything that could be possibly used to aid the Army, including industry, infrastructure, transportation, farming, everything. They're going to try to destroy it all. And that's going to be a three-pronged assault led by William Tecumseh Sherman in Georgia, Phil Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley, which is part of Virginia today, and Grant taking on Lee head-to-head in the Army of Northern Virginia and destroying them. This map, I might come back to this, but this is going to be kind of Sherman's plan to first take Atlanta and then eventually march to the sea. We might come back to that. Let's talk about their thoughts on total warfare. I like these two quotes from Grant and Sherman. The first one from Grant, this is his orders to Phil Sheridan. Leave nothing to invite the enemy to return. Destroy whatever cannot be consumed. Let the valley be left so that a crow flying over it will have to carry their rations along with them. Basically, the Shenandoah Valley was a huge source of supplies and a huge source of food for the Army of Northern Virginia, and Grant wants Sheridan to go in there and just destroy everything. Livestock killed, slaughtered, either taken for use by Sheridan's army or just destroyed just to deprive them of food. Farms destroyed, barns burnt to the ground. Really destroys the heart of the Shenandoah Valley. The second quote from Sherman kind of sums up war pretty well, actually. War is the remedy that our enemies have chosen. I say, let us give them all they want. War is cruelty. There's no use trying to reform it. The crueler it is, the sooner it will be over. And Sherman really puts that to use. He's extremely cruel. He's extremely fierce in his fighting. He embraces the concept of total war and destroys everything he comes across. And his thought process is, the crueler you fight, the harder you fight, the more you destroy not only the armies, but the towns and the homes and the farms. You destroy that, you destroy their will to fight. And he was right, and then that really did happen in Georgia and eventually in South Carolina. Grant's new style of warfare. Grant knew that he had a larger army. He had a superior army, and then all he had to do was fight what's called war of attrition, just outlast him. Grant had an army over or near 150,000 men. Lee only had 75,000, so his army was half the size. Grant could get reinforcements regularly. Lee at this point in the war cannot. The southern population had been so diminished that there's basically no more hopes for any more significant increase in troops for Lee. So that really harms Lee's chances at winning. And Grant's just going to continuously fight from now until the end of the war. What we see out of generals before Grant is that they would fight, and if they lost, they would stop, or they would retreat, or they would go back to Washington, D.C., they would regroup. Grant's just going to continuously fight from now until the end of the war. And we see that in the events of May to June 1864. Really some of the fiercest and hardest and nastiest fighting in the war, the Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, taking place all within the course of a month. As you see, those are casualty numbers just for the Union, not for the South. So as you see, Grant loses about 50,000 men in 1 month. And that's staggering. Okay, Lee only loses 28,000. But it's 28,000 out of 75,000, so more than a third of his men, and like I said, he can't replenish those numbers, so the size of his army is slowly dwindling. They fight fiercely for about a month, and then they get tangled in a deadlock at Petersburg, a siege. And a siege is a prolonged battle where you surround a town or surround a city and try to choke it off. And that siege is going to really kind of drag out for a while for the South and the North, so there's constant fighting, and then there's a kind of a long pause at that siege. It just takes months and months to come to an end. Well, eventually, with this new war style, new fighting style from Sherman and from Grant, the war does come to an end. One of the major events is that Sherman takes Atlanta. 1864 was not an easy year for the Union. With all those losses from Grant, the siege at Petersburg, Sherman for a while wasn't having much luck. There wasn't much positive going on. Lincoln actually feared that he wouldn't win re-election, and many of you maybe thought that was a foregone conclusion, or didn't even think about the fact that he had to run for re-election in the middle of a civil war. And that's really the first time in the history of the world that that happened, that there was a presidential election in the middle of a civil war. Lincoln refused to deny that, to suspend the idea of re-election, and basically declare himself a dictator. He knew that that would kind of destroy the democracy they'd worked so hard to build, so they allowed the presidential election to take place. Lincoln runs against McClellan, his former general, who promised to end the war if he was elected. The war was not going smooth at this point. It seemed, maybe beneficial to end the war. McClellan gained a lot of popularity as a close election, actually, fairly close. But one of the big things that happens about a month and a half before the election is that Sherman takes Atlanta. And Atlanta was the transportation hub of the South. It was kind of the industrial heart of the South. It was a huge, huge victory for the Union to take Atlanta. And after that, let's go back to the map real quick. After Sherman takes Atlanta on September 2nd, 1864, he starts his march to the sea, and that would add as well to the kind of the Union morale at the time. And Sherman would just destroy everything on his march through Atlanta. So after seizing Atlanta, Lincoln wins re-election for a second term, defeats McClellan, and that's kind of the last turning point. I talk about the 4 turning points of the Civil War, the first one being Antietam, the second and third one happening on the same day, July 3rd, when Vicksburg is seized by the Union, and Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg, is finally won after the failure of Pickett's charge. And the fourth turning point is that seizure of Atlanta. After that, it wouldn't be until the spring of 65, but in the spring of 65, Grant would break the siege of Petersburg. He shortly after would seize Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, and then just a few days later, Lee surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse. And then at that point, the war was effectively over. There'd be a little more fighting, a little more tension, but once the Army of Northern Virginia and Robert E. Lee surrendered, the war was basically over. You can pause the video and read through these quotes if you'd like, but I want to kind of wrap this up pretty quickly. This quote in particular, before you leave Carroll Middle, you'll see it posted on the wall as you walk towards the gymnasium. I don't know if you've ever noticed that before. I've asked kids, and most of them didn't notice that, so check that out if you get a chance. But let's move on. Lincoln's assassination. One of the great tragedies of the war is that Lincoln, he does see the war not completely end, but he does see Lee surrender, so he knows that the war is won. But just 5 days later, he's assassinated. John Wilkes Booth, an actor, kind of a guy that was desperate to do something great in his life, ends up originally he plotted to capture Lincoln and hold him ransom. He figured that wouldn't work out. And after hearing that Lincoln planned on giving former slaves, their right to vote, he decides to assassinate Lincoln. Lincoln, on April 14th, goes to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. to see a play. During the middle of the play, John Wilkes Booth sneaks into his booth. The guards were asleep or unaware of what was going on, didn't catch him in time, and he shoots Lincoln in the back of the head, jumps from the balcony and flees. Lincoln would die later the next day, and he'd be the first president of the United States to ever be assassinated. There's a lot of information you can come across and research about this assassination. It's an interesting story on what led John Wilkes Booth to this decision and the events before, during, and after the assassination. But we won't go into too much detail on that. But if you're interested, it's definitely something worth looking into and researching. Let's go and talk about the significance of the war. First of all, it's the deadliest war in American history. The estimates, I put the low end, 620,000 dead. Some estimate that the deaths were as high as 850,000 dead during the course of the war. That's not casualties. We always talk about casualties. That's dead. There were only about 200,000 battle deaths, but there's also a great deal of soldiers that died in prison camps, and then also a lot of soldiers died of disease. So we all know that disease was the #1 killer during the Civil War, so that accounted for a lot of those numbers. 25% of Southern men ended up a casualty of the Civil War. 25%, 1 in 4. So that's staggering. And also the Southern economy would be absolutely ruined, something that would take a while to build back up. That idea of total warfare left many Southern cities, Atlanta, Richmond, in complete ruins. Vicksburg in complete ruins. So really, really devastated the South. Like Sherman said, they kind of asked for it and they got it. But now that we were a united country, again, that would be something that we'd have to rebuild. And rebuild in really the mindset of that industrial economy, and kind of reconciling the differences. There would still be plenty of agriculture in the South, but the buildup of industry you would see after the Civil War. And the big thing is what we call the Civil War amendments. And I want to focus on the 13th Amendment. The 13th is probably the most significant, what the war was really fought about. The 14th and 15th are extremely important as well. But the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and that was an amendment that Lincoln had been working on all the way up until his death. Just a couple days before he dies, he sees the amendment ratified in the Senate. It would not pass through the House until after he died, and it would not actually go into effect until 1865. But the 13th Amendment is definitely one of the most important amendments that we have, ending slavery once and for all. 14th Amendment's extremely important too, because then it would give all citizens, and these freed slaves were now citizens, it would give those citizens equal protection of law. And basically, and that 14th Amendment really became extremely important for all people, and in particular minorities, those that weren't equally protected, women, Native Americans, freed slaves. The 14th Amendment's extremely important as well. And then, of course, the 15th Amendment came years into Reconstruction, and that would give full voting rights to all former slaves. It did not give full voting rights to all citizens, as you know. Women's right to vote wouldn't come until nearly the 1920s. Some Native American groups, of course, didn't have voting rights. So that did not give full voting rights, but it did give voting rights to those former male slaves. And the big significance of the Civil War is that it begins the process of fulfilling the promises made in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. I don't think we had fulfilled that at the end of the Civil War, but we're continuing to work towards that. It was the largest step that we had taken, basically since the founding of our country, to really fulfilling that promise of the Declaration of Independence. So that's it for our Civil War lectures, 4 lectures. If you watched all 4 of these, good job. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of listening to me talk. So I'm going to stop. Good job.